everyone, Oli here, and this is my review of Delta and the Bannermen, the third story of the 24th season of classic Doctor Who, starring Sylvester McCoy as the 7th Doctor. Delta and the Bannermen is the 150th story overall. It's 3 parts long and is written by Malcolm Cole. So the plot of the story is as follows. The time, 1959. The place, the Shangri-La Holiday Camp, South Wales. The Doctor and Mel want time out. The hedonistic alien Navarinos want to catch some vintage rock and roll, and 2 CIA agents want to know what happened to their country's missing satellite. When the beautiful Chimerian Princess Delta shows up on the scene, the murderous Bannermen soon follow in hot pursuit. The stage is set for a fiery showdown that will decide the fate of entire civilization. So that is the plot of Delta and the Bannermen. So in my opinion, I know the story isn't a fan favorite by any means, and I think some would even say that this is actually worse than the first 2 stories of the season, but in my opinion, I actually like Delta and the Bannerman. I do think it is one of my guilty pleasures, and I do think it is a very underrated Sylvester McCoy story. And I would say it is actually one of my favorites, but not like, I definitely would say that this is a favorite of my season. Spoiler for the rankings, but but I do think it definitely does have its faults that actually still has the same faults that actually plagued this season. And I think what really saved the story was the production. I think it was really good. Like, as it was actually filmed for a vast majority on location, and it looked pretty cool. I love the Welsh countryside, and of course the Shangri-La Holiday Camp has the mundane things appearing in Doctor Who actually do have some form of appeal to me anyways. The special effects look quite cool, except for when the bees were attacking Gavrock and the Bannermen in part 3. I love the costumings even from the Bannermen, the Navarinos, and even the holiday camp stuff. They all look quite cool and very modern and very nice. And I think and I love how this is the closest this Doctor Who has actually been to human life ever in a very long time. I do like that we get to see a lot more of these modernities in the Sylvester McCoy era. The script was quite good, and the direction by Chris Clough was actually not so bad. I think it was quite good as well. The plot, I would say, is quite basic. It wasn't meant to have worked, but it somehow did, and I think that it had the special charm that the first 2 stories lacked. And I think Delta and the Bannerman had that 1950s rock and roll aesthetic. It actually made this story look unique and rather original. I would say it actually really fit the story quite well. And I find it funny how the Space Bus was actually meant to have gone to Disneyland. I'm assuming it would have been around the 50th at the same time, but they ended up in a Welsh holiday camp. And I obviously doubt that the BBC could have even afforded to have filmed in Disneyland, but which is ironic now because Disney actually does have a stake in the production of the new story. Well, the upcoming stories and shooting at one. I think the 60th anniversary as well. So that is actually quite funny to think about. So originally, the Delta and the Bannerman was actually meant to be set in 1957 to tie in with the launch of Sputnik, but then it was moved 2 years later, so they can try and tie it to the story in the rock and roll aesthetic, which was a pretty good move as it made this story quite unique, as I said before, and it gives it its own unique charm compared to other stories in this season. And of course, this is the first glimpse of Andrew Cotmill's vision of Doctor Who and what's to come in the next 2 seasons. And as we know, that the show does become a bit darker in terms of the severity of the situation the Doctor found himself in, and of course the Doctor showing a new Machiavellian, manipulative side to himself, which we do kind of see a little aspect of his darker side when he literally berates Gavrock for having no humanity or any redeemable traits when they interact, and funny enough, that's the only time they interact in the story. But we do see more of the 7th Doctor pretty much savagely berating villains in this era, and Delta and the Bannermen was oddly quite violent because the Bannermen are a very murderous bunch, as well as Gavrock, their leader. They kill a bunch of folk on Delta's home planet, and Gavrock kills the Tollmaster after he wasn't able to tell them where Delta had disappeared to, and Gavrock actually builds up the informant that pretty much blabbed on Delta's location. And the Bannermen literally commit genocide when they blow up the bus full of Navarinos. And he almost kills Mo when she attempts to light it and to try and save Delta's skin. Yeah, and so but that scene when the Bagnaverinos all got killed in that bus was quite shocking, and obviously when Gavrock almost kills Mel, I think that was probably one of the best Mel scenes of this story, because I think that goes to show how much of a selfless companion Mel is when she thinks of other people. Although the story could have done without the violence a bit, but because Doctor got into trouble with this, as we all knew during the Fifth and Sixth Doctor's era, but I'm unsure why John Nathanson actually included that scene, but thankfully Andrew Carmel isn't that into violence anyway, so I'm pretty sure John Nathanson had pretty much told him off for that. And I personally think that Delta in the Venom has some great moments, even though a lot of the story pretty much involved the characters like the Doctor and Ray, Billy and Delta, and Mel pretty much driving along the Welsh countryside on their motorbikes. Which I do believe that was probably done to try and pad the story a bit, but I do think it was actually quite because especially with the music playing in the back, very reminiscent of the 50s. It was actually quite fun to see, but in terms of the great movements, I think the Doctor saving the space bus after it collided with the satellite, and how the Doctors are pretty much scrambling away in the TARDIS trying to save the bus, and he was like, and he actually uses his umbrella. And fun fact, this is actually the first time we actually see the Doctor's question mark umbrella in the story. So he uses the umbrella to try and reach for a control that he couldn't reach, and he's able to save the bus in time. And then after he saves the boss, he pretty much pretends as if the tip of the umbrella was a gun and blew smoke over it. I thought that was quite fun. And obviously, one scene that actually stands out, as I mentioned before, was the poor Navarinos getting killed by the Bannermen, and obviously what came afterwards was Mel. She got knocked to the ground because she was seeing them off, and then she was confronted by Gavrock, who was asking for Delta's location and saying if was she on the bus, and Mel says yes, but then unfortunately Delta and Delta and Billy drive past along with the Doctor, and obviously the Bannermen see this, and Mel pretty much screams no, and then she almost gets her head blown off by Gavrock, but she's saved by Burton, and I think that was a very interesting scene up here, and I think it is definitely the best scene of this story because, as I said before, it shows how dangerous Gavrock is and how underrated Mel was. But even though if Mel actually did tell them the truth, she probably would have ended up getting killed anyways. But I think the ending of this story was actually quite bittersweet because it does feature Billy pretty much leaving Earth to start a new life with Delta and the alien baby princess, who's just now grown to a teenager. I'll explain more on why that happened, but and of course with Hate the Future pretty much playing in the background, which was a not it was a song that was pretty much played for a good chunk of the story, but in part three especially, and it was a very sweet song, and it made the moment even more touching as Ray was pretty much saying goodbye to the man she loved, and she probably would never seen him again. And so the cliffhangers were quite good and quite intimidating, and I think especially part one's cliffhanger when the Doctor and Ray were pretty much cornered by the informant slash hitman who pretty much says that he doesn't kill for a living. It's something he personally enjoys, and that was quite intense. And the part two cliffhanger, although intense as well, this is when Gavrock and the Bannermen were pretty much holding their guns against the Doctor, Mel, and Burton as if they were going to shoot them. But then the way it was resolved was quite funny because the Doctor just walks off with Mel and Burton and just drive off. So on to the acting, which I say is definitely one of the best of the season. And I think Sylvester McCoy does a really good job, and he manages to shake off how awful the previous two stories were. And I like how he's coming to his own terms as his own Doctor. Although a chunk of his goofy elements have been dialed down, and subtle shades of who the Seventh Doctor really is start to come out a little bit. And as I said before, it was very evident in the scene with him and Gavrock towards the end of part two, where he berates Gavrock for not honouring the Doctor's peaceful arrival whilst he was asking for Mel and Burton to be freed. We do get to see more of the Doctor ripping into villains in a very scenery chewing way in this era, and this is actually one of my favourites. And guess which one is my favourite? And I'll be reviewing that very soon. and obviously, another aspect of this was how he pretty much brushes off Gavrok's death when Gavrok actually tried to kill the Doctor by setting the light booby trap on top of the TARDIS, and then that's how Gavrok was defeated. He ended up backing into the trap when the princess was doing her singing or whatever, and then which pretty much harmed the Bannermen, and then Gavrok pretty much was near the TARDIS, and he accidentally backed into it and blew him up, and then Mel pretty much tries to warn the Doctor about it, and then the Doctor just says, "Oh, it's alright." Gavrok absorbed all the energy and just brushed it off as if nothing really happened, and it just goes to show how the Doctor might see other beings as playthings, and which prompts him to manipulate them if he wants to. But it does. But he is the same goofish, scatterbrained Seventh Doctor that very charming towards others that we still know and love, especially how he was comforting Ray when he realized that when Ray realized that Billy didn't love her. Although it took him a fair bit to understand what happened, but he does understand what happened, and then they pretty much forget about it when he saves her life from the informant hitman. And I do like how he pretty much greets people, and he actually still does this in other stories as well, even in season 26. I remember he did it in Survival, and that was a funny scene as well, but I'll get to understand when I get to Survival, when he pretty much uses his hat as a form of, when he removes his hat and puts it back on as a form of a greeting as such. And as I said before, I actually like how the Doctor pretty much was scrambling to save the space bus, and that was another good comedic scene in which Sylvester McCoy shows off his good comedic timing and his physical comedy, with the Doctor using his umbrella to reach for a control in the TARDIS that he couldn't reach and blew smoke off the table as if it was a weapon or something. And I think Bodhi Langford did a very good job here as well. And I think this is one of the very few stories where she actually gets a decent amount of writing. She does do some heavy lifting in part 2, but then afterwards she doesn't really do much and just renegated at the background for most of the story. And pretty much most of the heavy lifting comes when the Doctor and Ray go off to look for Delta and Billy and the alien baby, while she pretty much has to remain on the camp to get the Navarinos to safety, and she actually does that quite well. And how she actually meets Delta in the story was quite interesting, because her and Delta ended up being roommates, and Delta was being very standoffish towards Mel, and she does actually bring this up to the Doctor, but then the Doctor realizes who she is and says that there could be possible danger coming soon, and towards the end of part 1, Delta starts opening up towards Mel, which Mel appreciated, and Mel even entered a dress for the dance into what that was happening towards the end of part 1. Now, I do find it funny how she sees the green baby and she pretty much screams, and then shortly afterwards, when Billy comes into the room and they were pretty much talking for most of the night, and Mel is just there sleeping. And then I do like how they decide to go, and then Delta realizes that Mel is asleep and said, "Poor Mel, she's been up all night." And so most of Mel's responsibility, as I said before, was trying to get the Navarinos to safety. Whilst the Doctor and Ray look for Billy and Delta, and all goes to plan, and they almost do leave until Bannerman, of course, destroys the Navarinos, and then that's how we get that scene with Mel and Gavrok, which I do think is a very interesting scene as well, as I said before. But yeah, I think, but then afterwards, after the Bannermen capture Mel and the Doctor rescues her and Burton, she doesn't really do much for the rest of the story, and is just there in the background. So, onto the sidecast, I thought they were mostly good. First off, we have Delta, the Chimerian Queen who flees the planet as a result of the Bannermen wiping out her planet. Her companion gets killed just before the companion wounds Gavrok, and he leaves her with a strange pod, and she ends up on the toll port and enters the space bus that was initially going to Disney to evade the Bannermen. And so, upon arriving in Shangri-La, her and Mel become roommates, but she is quite distant and very snappy towards Mel, but obviously due to the stress of the situation that is understandable. But then she later opens up to Mel, and Mel obviously lends her a dress. She falls for Billy whilst Billy falls for her at the same time, so the two spend most of the story together with the Chimerian princess, which was the alien baby who actually grows up throughout most of the story anyways. Yes, and after the Bannermen are defeated, she says a big thanks to everyone that helped her, and she returns to her home planet with Billy in tow with the Chimerian princess, who is now seemingly a teenager. I thought Delta was a good character, but I do feel as if that the actress actually spoken the same monotonous tone throughout the entire story. I do think that they could have at least given her some personality, or she could have at least gone down some Bannerman or worse on Shangri-La. But I understand that she had the Chimerian princess, but the Chimerian princess was pretty much like a teenager, and maybe she could have stayed with the Doctor or even Burton, but no. But then we had Murray and the Navarinos. Murray was a Navarino bus driver, and the Navarinos, the alien form, they look purple and squiddish, kind of like a mixture of a crinoid and an oversized colored mutant was of such form, but then they were able to. But then the humanoid form, they look very human, and we see this in the part one where Murray was going through the converter thing from a Navarino to a human being. So they arrive at the holiday camp after the near-death experience, but then the Navarinos, because of the love of rock and roll, they didn't seem too disappointed that they ended up on the holiday camp. They just, well, considering the fact that they had a near-death experience, I don't think they would have minded anything at all. But they did. The Navarinos looked very fun-loving and very, and I liked how they pretty much took the best out of the best of the worst case scenario possible. But as I said, they love the whole rock and roll feel of the 50s, especially Murray. They all get killed in part two by the Bannermen in a very shocking scene, and it was a shame because I actually liked Murray. I liked how he and Mel were pretty much how he got on with Mel and how he's actually concerned for her while she decided to stay behind in the camp. And then we have Kelly, the informant. He was a mercenary slash informant that traveled on the space bus, and he keeps an eye on Delta. It's assumed that he's working for Gavrok, but he's just a hitman after the money. Well, not necessarily after the money, but he actually does personally enjoy killing people. After giving away Delta's location, Gavrok blows him up, and honestly, I feel like this character was just there for convenience plus disposability. But I do think more could have been done with him, but no. And then we have the Tollmaster. He worked at the Tollport G715, and when the Doctor and Mel arrive in the Tollport, they become their 10 billionth customer and offers them to travel to Disneyland for free. Though Mel takes up on this offer, the Doctor travels in the TARDIS. So shortly after they leave, and they go, of course, and end up in Shangri-La, but then they didn't know that. The Bannerman arrived to inquire about the location of Delta, but he couldn't actually give them that info because he doesn't know where the boss ended up. So Gavrok realizes this and lets him go, but then they end up killing the poor guy. Then the funny thing is, he's actually played by a comedian played Ken Dodd. I'm assuming he's obviously way before my time, and he was actually promoted in this story. Like he was in the promo images of this story. I'm assuming because he was a big name in the 80s, and he actually appeared in the promo shoots in Shangri-La, which is quite funny because he actually never ends up there, and he actually dies. And when he's killed by the Bannerman, that pretty much happens very early on. And then we have Weissmuller and Hawk, American agents from the CIA on the mission to look for a satellite they're asked to monitor, but obviously had collided with the Tollport. They get apprehended by the Bannerman, but then Ray finds them and frees them, and they aid the Doctor in protecting Delta and the Princess, as well as stopping Gavrok. I thought they were okay characters, but they didn't really contribute a great deal to the story. But there was one scene towards around the start of the story where they're actually using a police box to try and get in touch with the American officials. And what was even funny because pretty much everyone thought at the same time that it was a TARDIS, but I don't know what a police box would be doing in a very Welsh countryside, especially looking so not abandoned but very rare. It was rare to see any signs of life there. Then we also have Burton. He was the camp leader of the Shangri-La holiday camp. He used to be an army major, and the staff actually called him Major as a term of affection, and he too cared for them. He took the Navarinos and they didn't believe that they were aliens until the Doctor showed him and Ray the inside of the TARDIS. Before the Bannermen arrived, he stayed behind to evacuate the holiday camp makers as well as his staff because he was concerned for them, and he just chose to stay behind to make sure nothing happens. And he did the Navarinos in evacuating. He saved Mel from getting killed by by Gavrok and the Bannermen, and they were also held hostage by the Bannermen until the Doctor saved them. He's a bit absent-minded, and he can be a bit away with the fairies because there was one towards the end of the story after the Bannermen had all been defeated and apprehended and taken back to Delta's home planet. He was actually like looking outside the window of his office with I assume was a sword, and then the Doctor tries to tell Burton that it's all over, but then Burton pretty much tries to like attack the Doctor with his sword, but then he realizes that the danger is over. I like how absent-minded he is, but I really do like Burton. Then we have Ray. She was a young mechanic and one of the locals. Her and Billy were very good childhood friends, even though she does harbor some feelings for him, but he doesn't feel the same way, and he didn't even notice that she felt that way. Despite this, she does help the Doctor looking for Billy and Delta and the Princess and help save the day. And whilst Billy decides to start a new life with Delta on her home planet, and she was obviously very heartbroken, but he tells her to look after his bike. She's a very good character, and fun fact, I was actually meant to have replaced Miller as the companion, but I do feel like she was an early version of Ace, very hands-on, but she's slightly more naive than Ace. But and what's even funnier is that Sophie Aldrich, who plays Ace, actually auditioned to play Ray in this story, and that's just very fun. And what even makes this even more interesting is that a big Finnish story called Gods and Monsters actually hinted at Ray being a wolf of Fenric, and I'll get to that. I'll explain what that is when I get to the review of Curse of Fenric. And then we have Billy. He was a mechanic working at the camp, and he was tasked with fixing the space bus. But he had obviously had no idea what to do, and because he wasn't used to the odds and ends of the bus, because the bus was from the future, and obviously then in the bloody 50s. He fell for Del. He and Ray were childhood friends, but obviously Ray fell for him, and but he didn't really notice her feelings for her, and he just pretty much assumed that they were just strong friends, and then he actually ended up falling in love with Delta, who was willing to take on the Bannerman and Gavrok himself because of that. He took some of the Chimerian jelly that Delta was using to feed the princess, so he can turn into a Chimerian and be with Delta. He leaves Earth with Delta and the princess. That's because he loves her, and once again, this is just pretty typical Doctor Who, having people falling in love after just instantly meeting. He was an okay character. Part of me wants to beat the shit out of him because of how he didn't realize that Ray was in love with him, but at the same time, you can't help who you love at the end of the day, and he might not have realized it, and I don't think if Ray actually came clean about her feelings for him, I don't think he would have felt the same way, but yeah. Then we also have Gornry. He was an elderly beekeeper who lived near the holiday camp. He accommodated Billy, Delta, and the princess, but then realizing the Bannermen were nearby and he probably would have attacked the house, he set up a room full of jars of honey that the door would break if the door had opened, which obviously Gavrok and the Bannermen do, and then they all get honey splattered all over them, and they get some nice bee stings for their troubles. He went at the dematerializing TARDIS at the end, which I thought was quite nice. And finally, we have the Chimerian Princess. This was the space baby that Delta was given to and hatch at the end of part one. And she hatched, which was witnessed by Mel and Delta, and she was given some Chimerian jelly to help her grow to a teenager by the story's end. She had this high pitched screeching singing voice that was very harmful to the Bannermen, and the Doctor pretty much used the scream to amplify her high pitched screaming to pretty much send Gavrok and his brood of Bannermen to defeat them, and obviously defeated Gavrok with his own trap that he laid for the Doctor. Of course, we have our main villains, which was Gavrok and his Bannermen. They were criminals who were very genocidal, and at the start of the story, we see them battling and killing some Chimerians. Their leader Gavrok tries to kill Delta, but he's wounded by the Chimerian he shot and killed before ultimately dying. He leads the Bannermen to Wells to search for Delta. Upon arriving at the holiday camp, they kill the Navarinos and capture Mel and Burton. Gavrok and the Bannermen were very violent people who would kill anyone if they felt like it, just ask the toll master in the toll port. Well, so they met the end when Gavrok was killed by his own trap that he tried to set for the Doctor, and the Bannermen were apprehended and taken back to stand trial. I would say that Gavrok is one of the best villains of this season, even though why he went after Delta was and the Chimerians was never explained, or there's no any deeper explanation as to what made Gavrok so violent. I still find him and the Bannermen very intimidating, especially though they're just killing people left, right, and center, which I thought was quite interesting. But there could have been more to explain their motives, but no. So on to the main faults. Not many, but I do think that the plot does lag in some places, especially in part 2 and some of part 3, as most of it was spent having the Doctor Ray, Billy, Delta, and the Princess driving on the motorbike. So obviously, this was obvious padding, but obviously, as I said before, I liked it, but it was pretty obvious that they pretty much used that to try and make the story a bit longer. But I think that when I also think that Hawk and Weissmuller were in the story for a bit too long, I feel like they could have being killed by the Bannerman in part 2 or something, because it seemed very irrelevant for most of the story, even though yes, the satellite did collide with the space bus, but then that plot was not mentioned at all or for most of the story after the action kicks off, and how they were just pretty much apprehended by the Bannerman. I do think that they could have been killed earlier on, but yeah. But I still really enjoyed Delta and the Bannerman. I do think that this is the most underrated story of the Sylvester McCoy era, and to finish off this review, I do think Delta and the Bannerman is a lovely story with a special rock and roll throwback to the 1950s. It's a bundle of fun with appropriately handled moments of seriousness with subtle hints as to what will come later in the McCoy era that will change the course of Doctor Who's trajectory. So I'll give Delta and the Bannerman an 8 out of 10. My next review will be Dragonfire, the last story of the season, which sees the departure of Mel and the introduction of one of the greatest companions ever, Ace, who happens to be the last companion of the Classic Who era. So thanks for watching. Please let me know what you thought of this story and this review. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Like this video, share it with your friends, families, mom, dad, dog, aunties, boyfriend, and I'll see you later.